someone else that you will choose. 3 people. We can do it in the media center for our circulation within.
I don't know. You should ask everybody to move to sit.
Ah, okay. Good morning, everyone. If you could please get some coffee, some muffins, or some croissant, and please take your seat up front as soon as possible because we're almost ready to start. I know you're enjoying the great conversations. I can hear it, but we'll have a chance to really do that. Thank you. Abike?
Who is the presenter? We have already the pointer. Not the pointer. Clicker.
Is Padmashri presenting?
So at the time she will present, then we'll give her. We show the way to get it. Because now she can forget.
Yeah, exactly.
She's stressful.
Yeah.
So that's more.
Yeah, we're just waiting to get started. To get started.
Hi, I'm Grace. I work with Catsell. It's me.
I'm Abby Kerr. I work with Cameron and I coordinated this event, so I'm very on edge, trying to make sure it all goes well.
It seems like we have everything handled, but if there are any problems, please let me know. I'll try my best to help.
Thank you so much.
That's why I'm here, because Kuketsu is running around. Yeah, I think she's overseeing all of the side events right now.
She was really great actually. She's wonderful. I'm not sure you guys were just like swamped with emails. I feel like I've been blowing up. Morning, everyone. Please feel free to take your coffee to your seats so we can get started. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Please feel free to take your coffee straight to your seats so we can get going. Once you grab some breakfast, you can just go and sit down. Thank you.
I don't think she will make it.
Okay. But I'm very happy you came, Stanley.
I'm here.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
Professor, are we waiting?
Good morning, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. I'd like to thank the African Development Bank for organizing this very important meeting and for inviting me for this presentation. So the title of my presentation is Enhancing Access to Health Technologies for Pharmaceutical Manufacturing in Africa. The inequity in access to medical countermeasures in low-income countries have been quite glaring. The COVID Good morning, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. I'd like to thank the African Development Bank for organizing this very important meeting and for inviting me for this presentation. So the title of my presentation is Enhancing Access to Health Technologies for Pharmaceutical Manufacturing in Africa. The inequity in access to medical countermeasures in low-income countries have been quite glaring. The COVID pandemic has taught us a lot. We saw that 68.6% of the
I hope you can hear me now. So just imagine if the room was only this big, where I'm standing. I hope to see everybody come in front of me. so that we can actually fill up the first set of rows. We can still maintain a seat between each other, but I encourage everybody, and I'm looking at lots of people. Yes, this is the last row, so you're fine. But everybody else, please, if you can come on my side or in front of me. I see the gentleman on the outside. If you can move, yes. Ah, okay. Okay, great. I hope I don't have to stand here to guide everybody who joins. Yes, please, if you could come forward. This is the end of the room. Yeah. And please bear with us. We're waiting for the Honorable Minister from the government of Rwanda to join us, and then we'll get started. We understand he's around the corner, so just bear with us. So, good morning, Honorable Minister, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me well. I'm hearing a bit of an echo, but if you can hear me well, thank you very much. So, apologies for this early start today, but many thanks to all of you for coming to learn about the African Pharmaceutical Technology Foundation, or APTF for short. As background, the African Development Bank received approval from its board of directors earlier in 2022 to help set up the African Pharmaceutical Technology Foundation, which is a new groundbreaking institution that will significantly enhance Africa's access to the technologies that underpin the manufacture of medicines, vaccines, and other pharmaceutical products. We at the AFDB have a long history and experience of facilitating groundbreaking Pan-African institutions that transform their respective landscapes across Africa. In response to demands from African countries and to deliver on the strategic priorities of the AFDB and its shareholders. Examples include the creation of Africa 50 to transform infrastructure project development in Africa, the creation of Afri-Exim Bank and the Trade and Development Bank to address the major gaps in trade finance across the continent, and then supporting the establishment of African Union market institutions such as the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat and the Africa CDC through institutional support grant programs with plans to do the same for the Africa Medicines Agency. To understand why we are now facilitating the establishment of the African Pharmaceutical Technology Foundation, please bear with me while I provide some high-level context. So the COVID-19 crisis has exposed the fragility of global health systems and highlighted the need for countries to ensure a minimum level of supply security for health products. The pandemic revealed gaps in the provision of critical drugs and medicines and gave rise to damaging responses as countries started to impose bans on the export of certain key products. Africa is heavily reliant on imports. Up to 70% of pharmaceutical products are imported. Local vaccine production capacities address less than 1% of the local demand in value. African governments, like many others worldwide, are now looking to develop their local pharmaceutical sectors to ensure supply security, make medicines more affordable, release pressure on the balance of payments, and create wealth more broadly. So beyond a response to these immediate challenges, there are three compelling rationales for governments to consider developing a local pharmaceutical industry to strengthen their healthcare defense systems. First is the public health rationale. Here, a developed local pharmaceutical industry could offer affordable access to medicines that fit the local, and my pronunciation of the next word is always troublesome, epidemiological profile at a quality aligned to international standards. Second is the strategic rationale. It is important for governments to ensure national health sovereignty and a minimum security of supply of critical pharmaceutical products. And third is an economic rationale. A competitive pharmaceutical industry can participate in creating an economically viable industrial base and thus contribute to economic growth, reduce dependence on imports, create quality jobs, and improve the trade balance. When I talk about the economic rationale, there's somebody who is always ringing in my head, and that is Professor Banji, the industrialization guru from the African Development Bank. He will give closing remarks, but Professor Banji is always talking to me about industrialization, and that is actually one of the ways in which we started to look at the pharmaceutical space prior to the COVID crisis. But with the COVID crisis, we've had to look at it also as a key healthcare imperative. And in addition, we've also even developed our own healthcare strategy, the quality healthcare strategy for Africa. And Babatunde, who's one of the key architects of that, is also in the room. And I hope you would also have a chance to talk to them bilaterally, in the course of the day. But in response to calls from the African Union and active pharmaceutical sector players, the AFDB has taken a leadership role to consolidate Africa's aspirations into a continental vision and action plan towards a new African pharmaceutical order. The vision has filled up the policy gap for African countries, regional development communities, and health and pharmaceutical institutions, and is currently providing an integrated platform for dialogue and financing for a stronger pharmaceutical sector. We call it the Africa 2030 Pharmaceutical Vision, which stipulates that the continent should aspire to focus on the top 30 molecules, which account for approximately 30% of Africa's pharmaceutical market and help addresses its public health issues. Increasing local production of these top 30 molecules from just over a quarter to 2/3 over the 10-year period will enable local producers to increase their share of total pharmaceutical production to between 45 and 50% within the decade. Enablers are needed, such as investing in regional logistics integrated infrastructure, supporting the implementation of good manufacturing practices, quality standards, seeding the R&D capacities focused on the Africa disease burden and needs, and paving the way for increased vaccine manufacturing in Africa. Significant investments in local manufacturing capacity and related infrastructure will definitely be needed, and we at the African Development Bank are committed to providing part of these financings. While these strategies, action plans, and enablers are all good, Up until now, efforts to rapidly expand the manufacturing of essential pharmaceutical products in Africa have been hampered by a lack of technological know-how of both the manufacturing process and the R&D domains in Africa. Hence, a more rigorous and systematic effort to change the overall technology environment in which African pharma companies operate. So this calls for support at several levels. Practically, as of today, most African pharma companies do not have the scouting and negotiation capacity and bandwidth to engage with global pharmaceutical companies. Several also lack the technical know-how to apply new technologies as part of the current and planned partnerships, which will impact their capacity to use the current initiatives to build sustainable and resilient pharmaceutical production capacity. Secondly, African R&D and innovation ecosystems are fragmented and need to be rehauled to support African companies in pharmaceutical production and innovation. Finally, African companies need to offer more longer-term support and incentives for local pharma companies to access and build on existing and new technologies by furthering collaborative linkages, creating partnerships, and facilitating market creation for locally produced pharmaceutical products. Therefore, in a full circle, a dedicated institution is needed on the ground in Africa to support the practical implementation of these goals. It will facilitate technology access, technology transfer, and technological learning in the pharmaceutical sector, as Professor Sampath likes to articulate. This will be the key topic of our discussion today, with a lead presentation and facilitation of a panel by Professor Padma Shri Sampath, who has guided us, to getting our board approval within the African Development Bank for the Africa Pharmaceutical Technology Foundation, and currently serves as a special advisor to the president of the African Development Bank on health and pharmaceuticals. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Professor Sampath. But one of the things that Professor Sampath will talk about is the Eminent Advisory Council of the Africa Pharmaceutical Technology Foundation. And I think when she mentions really those who have agreed to participate, it will be really clear that the Africa Pharmaceutical Technology Foundation is really an African, Pan-African institution, not an AFDB institution, that has the support of preeminent parties because of the importance that it actually would serve to bring local production capacities to the levels where process efficiencies, cost efficiencies, et cetera, would ultimately deliver for the best for African people. Professor Sampath, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, VP Quaynor, for that introduction. And it is truly my honor to present the African Pharmaceutical Technology Foundation at this meeting today. Your Excellency, Honorable Minister of State, Dr. Butera, esteemed panelists who joined me in person and online, ladies and gentlemen. Last week, we reached a significant landmark. We passed 1,000 days since the WHO first declared a COVID-19 pandemic worldwide. In this time, we have learned a number of key lessons. The first lesson is that innovation and production at a global scale does not solve the problem of allocation, affordability, and deployment. Affordability, equitable allocation, and eventual innovation depend on the ability to domestically manufacture. Global correlation exists today between manufacturing capacity of countries and COVID-19 immunization rates. And this access restriction is not just about vaccines, but also therapeutics and diagnostics, and most recently, the COVID-19 antiretrovirals. The second lesson we need to bear in mind is that manufacturing capacity is critical for pandemic preparedness and should not be left to the market. In this slide, on the left side, you see where current vaccine manufacturing capacity exists. And that corresponds with the manufacturing supply arrangements for COVID-19 vaccines that have been voluntarily concluded worldwide on the right side. The third lesson for us is both pandemic and routine innovation depends on pre-existing advances. For pandemic innovation, the two leading mRNA COVID-19 vaccines built on the shoulders of decades of research on mRNA and platforms. The AstraZeneca vaccine built on decades of research on viral vector platforms. There was extensive amount of public funding that went into creating the innovations that finally led to the pandemic success that we saw with the breakthrough of these vaccines a few months after the announcement of the pandemic. And public funding critically promoted this technology development. CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Initiative, a crucial agency in this context, provided $1.4 billion US funding for two of the lead vaccines, Moderna and AstraZeneca. The same is true for routine innovation. If you take the global insulin market, you have top firms that lead the production of analog insulin today. And these build on already existing innovations that happened for years in the same companies that hold global monopolistic positions. And on the right side, you see how that affects access to medicines. There are 24 countries with no insulin registered at all, and a large number of African countries have little or no access to insulin today. The next lesson is that exclusive rights make it difficult to secure the full licensing of underlying technologies. A good example is the WHO set up mRNA Hub, where the two top players with the mRNA vaccines did not participate in the full licensing of the underlying technologies. And on the right side, I am showing you a map of critical successes that the Medicines Patent Pool has accomplished. And we have a colleague from the Medicines Patent Pool in the audience. These are 3 COVID antiretroviral drugs, but of these, only 4 licenses have been given to Africa over the course of 1 year. The fifth lesson for us is that more complex the technologies for production, the greater the difficulties in learning, and the larger the gap we need to bridge. In this figure, you see the map of current mRNA technologies and the firms that are the innovators. Incumbent companies globally have specific advantages. These are not just financial or market share related. These are technological. And African companies today operate in a different environment than what we saw in India or East Africa 30 years ago. It is global intellectual property regimes. There's limited space to maneuver, and there are difficulties in transacting for technology. We need more incentives and new ways to think about technology and technology access. So we had 10 companies producing vaccines on the continent at the start of the pandemic. And today we have grown to 30 initiatives in 13 countries. How do we build on these successes? Where do we go from here? A number of technology risks exist for African companies today to build a sustainable pharmaceutical sector. For instance, if you take the vaccine announcements, most of these are to build capacity in COVID-19 vaccines at a time that we know that global demand is waning and there may not be a need for these COVID-19 vaccines by the time African companies are up and running to produce COVID-19 vaccines. In general, this shows to us that a product-by-product approach puts African companies at risk, even if we make financing available. What we need to build surge capacity for the continent and for the world, we need profitable firms that can produce and cater to the region's demands over time. This calls for product diversification. We need to reduce the financial risks for African companies because although we make initial investment available, it is they who have to thrive in this environment with a large number of global risks and demand uncertainties and a changing global procurement environment. And we need a more holistic focus that moves away from just vaccines to all kinds of pharmaceutical products that are needed in the continent. This calls for a big technological push. We need to have technology licensing and technology sourcing. We need IP assistance to African firms, searching for global prior art, helping African companies in the art of commercializing intellectual property, and working with African public institutions to commercialize intellectual property. We need to mobilize domestic resources for African pharmaceutical firms to apply the technologies and to take risks for local production and innovation. We need to have more inputs into technologically upgrading by creating innovation ecosystems at the African level and the sub-regional levels. And we need technology diversification. We need horizontal technology diversification, meaning more products at the fill and finish and formulation level, and we need vertical technology diversification, meaning that African firms need to move backwards to integrate into R&D and innovation. This is what the APTF will do. It will provide this big push that the African pharmaceutical sector needs today. It will focus on diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines, personal protection equipment, and on regulatory support systems. The APTF is built on learning from the past, not just in Africa, but across the world, particularly from the other global southern countries. It builds on the lesson that such technology access and transfer requires a holistic undertaking. It's not done in a matter of few weeks. It's not done in months. It takes years, and it takes sustained support into licensing, training, know-how transfer, skills and capabilities building, and innovative financing mechanisms. This is what will ultimately help African companies diversify, access and leverage the regional market, promote performance and access into international markets, including through the new procurement mechanisms being introduced at Gavi, and make African firms future ready for pandemics. APTF scope is on building supply chains. It's on every level of pharmaceutical production and innovation. It will move from packaging and labeling to reducing the cost of goods across each and every pharmaceutical subsector, to formulating fill and finish, to API and drug substance manufacturing, to building research and development. How will the APTF do that? So it has 5 functions. It will strategically, I don't know what's happening with this remote, if anyone can help me. It will strategically advance a technology agenda for local production, working closely with already existing African institutions and global institutions. It will facilitate market-based transactions through increased voluntary licensing and prepare such licenses, prepare local companies for such licenses. It will assist local African companies holistically for technology acquisition and technology upgrading. It will promote impact-driven models for technology engagement, including regional R&D funds, regional pooling, public-private partnerships for diseases that are of relevance to Africa and where public research institutes have their strengths. And it will strengthen pharmaceutical production and innovation ecosystems in Africa by contributing and working with other institutions for skills building and capabilities. The structure of the APTF is 4 separate arms: technology searching and matching mechanism for pharmaceutical production that will focus on increased licensing, an impact-driven technology management unit, which is going to focus on new impact-driven technology models for the continent, a Pan-African regional ecosystem development platform, which will focus on R&D ecosystems, and a technology strategic services and advice unit, which will work with national governments and pharmaceutical industry associations in the continent to increase TRIPS flexibilities and their use and better and more coordinated frameworks. With this introduction, I want to introduce the distinguished panel that joins us today from different parts of the world, both personally and virtually. Each of the panelists that we have today is a top expert in the field. I'm not even going to venture out to introduce them. I will pose 2 questions per panelist, and um, I will lead you through a sort of Q&A through this session now that follows. There will be a gentle nudge from me after 5 minutes, so that we leave a little bit of time for question and answers. So first off, we have Honorable Minister of State, Dr. Butera. So, Dr. Butera, my question for you is, hoarding, export restrictions, and vaccine. Oh, sorry, yes. So sorry. I would first like to invite all our panelists to come on stage. So on stage we have the Honorable Minister of State, Dr. Butera, and then we have Dr. Precious Matsoso, and we have Professor Fred Abbott. And we have 3 panelists who join us remotely. Dr. Richard Hatchett, the Executive Director of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Initiative. We have Professor Carlos Correa, the Executive Director of the South Center, and Ms. Birgit Pickel, the Director General for Africa, Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development of Germany. So I would like to commence with you, Dr. Butera. And my question to you is, hoarding, export restrictions, and vaccine nationalism have become prominent during COVID-19 pandemic. And we should expect this to be the way it goes in future pandemics. And this is why the African region, and particularly the government of Uganda, has taken massive steps in supporting initiatives that build pharmaceutical production capacity in the African region. Can you elaborate how the Rwandan government has been working since the pandemic to, in the national and regional frameworks, to change these conditions for pharmaceutical production? And how do you think an agency like the APTF can strengthen what is already going on ground?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Small correction, I'll speak about what the government of Rwanda instead did. When the pandemic hit, we quickly activated existing mechanisms to mobilize our health workforce, and by establishing a national task force that coordinated at the country level the response mechanism. And when it was time to roll out the vaccines, we received vaccines through bilateral partnerships, donations, but also by mobilizing resources to procure vaccines. Now, building on the existing cold chain that we had in the country and the health decentralization program, we achieved good coverage for vaccination. So as of today, we have 99% of 2 doses coverage for 12 years old and above. And this is built on many years of building the primary health program and supply chain. So to give you an example, as soon as we receive a vaccine, within 24 hours to the most remote place in the country, we are able to deliver that dose of vaccine. However, we saw a lot of challenges in terms of receiving vaccines on time due to various reasons. And to bridge that gap, Rwanda resolved to bring end-to-end manufacture of vaccine on the continent. And Rwanda is committed to work with all partners to bridge that gap. And by 2040, the African Union should be able to have that 60% of the vaccines that we need be produced on the continent. So any initiative aimed at bringing biomanufacturing on the continent is supported by Rwanda. And such an initiative like this one that we're talking about, we think is going to be really, really important and critical to bridge that gap, not only for the sake of bridging that gap, but it's also just a principle of bridging the health inequity that we have faced for quite some time. So I think Rwanda is committed to work with all partners and all organizations and countries that are willing to see this to fruition. And there are actually a lot of initiatives on the continent that are happening to make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And I should actually mention that we are extremely grateful to the support that has been given to the APTF from His Excellency President Kagame and the government of Rwanda from the start, from the time that this foundation was conceptualized by the African Development Bank. So thank you very much for that. I would like to next move. Our next speaker could not join us in person, but has sent us a video recording, which late last night. And this is the Assistant Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Hanan Balki. Given that WHO has been at the center of these debates from the time that the pandemic broke out, Dr. Hanan Balki will talk to us about the two important initiatives that WHO has housed since March 2020, the mRNA Hub and the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool.
Good morning, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. I'd like to thank the African Development Bank for organizing this very important meeting and for inviting me for this presentation. So the title of my presentation is Enhancing Access to Health Technologies for Pharmaceutical Manufacturing in Africa. The inequity in access to medical countermeasures in low-income countries have been quite glaring. The COVID pandemic has taught us a lot. We saw that 68.6% of the world population received at least one dose. However, only 24.9% of people in low-mid-income countries received at least one dose. So that's really too little, too late. The barriers to medical countermeasures in low-mid-income countries are many. However, these are some of the top ones. The lack of access to the know-how for manufacturers in low-mid-income countries, whether the vaccine, as I gave the numbers earlier, but for many of the other tools, whether therapeutics and diagnostics and others. There was lack of operational regulatory capacity in recipient countries, lack of trained local workforce, local production that is hampered by limited regional markets and international competition, and inefficiencies of supply chains in the countries. So what we're here to talk about today, what I wanted to focus on is the CTAP, or the WHO COVID Technology Access Pool. This was a solidarity call to action that was initiated by, actually in May 2020, very early in the pandemic days, by Costa Rica's president and the WHO Director General, with several partners, including UNITAID, UNDP, UNAIDS, Medicines Patent Pool, and others, supported to date by 44 WHO member states. And the concept is quite simple. It's a global one. It's a stop shop where developers and
Apologies for this slight technology glitch. I think colleagues are trying to fix it. I think we're going to move on to the next panelist, and we will come back to this video recording in a bit. I would like to next call on Dr. Precious Matsoso. Dr. Precious Matsoso is currently the co-chair of the International Negotiating Body of the World Health Organization on pandemic preparedness, prevention, and response. Precious has worked probably for a very long time. She's been probably one of the first people who worked at WHO on local production and tech transfer. So with that background, Precious, I'm really pleased that you joined us here today. And as you know, more than probably anybody else, intellectual property, production, tech transfer, and know-how are important themes of discussion at the World Health Organization and other international agencies for a long time. And they're also very important for the INB. So can you just share with us how the INB is and what is the role of the INB currently and what the INB is for our audience, and also reflect on how actually these important topics can be better situated in the international negotiating body, and what can regional developments like the APTF do to help in this regard?
Well, thank you for your questions, and good morning, Minister. Good morning, colleagues, friends. Indeed, you know, it's been what, 15 years since we had a landmark agreement to come up with 8 broad principles. Firstly, to promote R&D and support R&D, but we've also articulated at the time that we needed tech transfer and local production, and we identified access as being important, that we had to facilitate access and support management of IP and as well as local production. But there was also another piece which was important, and this was about innovative financing. So fast track that to about maybe 2-3 years later, we commissioned work to do a study to look at tech transfer and local production for vaccines, pharmaceuticals, as well as diagnostics. And I think what is important is that then we already identified what needed to be done. And sadly, not much moved. And it took COVID for us to have a wake-up call. And I'm glad that this reignited movement, I would call it reignited movement, because everybody now is talking about tech transfer and local production. But it's not just about talking about tech transfer and local production, it's about active steps that are taken to make sure that this becomes a reality. And I must applaud you, actually, for establishing this foundation, because initiatives like United, Medicine Patent Pool were actually born out of those efforts to facilitate access and foster innovation. And I think they evolved and have become some of our responses to the most pressing issues about access to equitable access to medical products. And I see an opportunity, particularly with this foundation. I thought I should start with that before I come back to the pandemic treaty. You'll all realize that the crisis we had of COVID took member states, because we've had crises before. We've had a whole lot of pandemics, but it means our response was poor and we underinvested, grossly underinvested in preparedness. And the groundbreaking decision that was taken by 194 countries to come up with a legally binding instrument in the form of a treaty was a good one, because it identified equity as one of the key areas that needed to be addressed. Secondly, it identified governance arrangements as both globally, regionally, and locally as areas that needed some investigation, but as well as action that would ensure that we are not in this position where we are today, where we have a crisis because of lack of investments, lack of preparedness, basically. So where we are today is that we've recognized that we needed to address equity, we needed to address governance, but also financing, so that in future we have sustainable, predictable financing, and we can ensure that we are better prepared. But it also had to do with health system strengthening and to ensure that our health systems were resilient. So the treaty, much as we've discussed the importance of the treaty. It will take member states actually to agree to what is contained in the treaty. And there are a number of principles I think that we've identified about access, about equity, and you know, solidarity, and the right to health, and so on. But I think what is going to be important is that we embed in the treaty aspects that deal with tech transfer and production, but regionalization and the strengthening of regional approaches. And one of the areas, of course, we identified barriers. We identified them then, 15 years ago, when we did our studies to look at tech transfer for vaccines, pharmaceuticals, as well as diagnostics. We identified those barriers: administrative, technical, legal, as well as regulatory barriers. And we still identified those even with the pandemic. So I see an opportunity with this legally binding instrument as an opportunity to address all those barriers that we had identified. So I'm hoping that with this foundation, we can provide support, we can promote, but we can also use it as a basis of assisting various countries to come up to speed and be able to address all these barriers that I referred to earlier. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Precious, for that. I just wanted to check if you would like to reflect on the notion of equitable access and how we are going to deal with that in the pandemic treaty, or how it's being dealt with at the INB. Because, I mean, during COVID-19, equitable access just became a buzzword. And although we had the COVAX facility, two people who had the same kind of vulnerability in different parts of the world never got the same access to vaccines.
Well, I would say, you know, with this pandemic, for me, it's déjà vu because it started with HIV and AIDS. And historically, we had similar kind of experiences where there were serious access problems. And we looked at some of the provisions of the TRIPS agreements, as you may know, and I just wanted to refer to some of the provisions that, firstly, it's intended to contribute to, you know, to public health. And we had considered that we had to have public health safeguards and ensure that the flexibilities that are in the TRIPS agreement can be explored, fully explored in such a way that access can be facilitated. But secondly, there are provisions that allowed for early working. So it means even though there could be patent protection for some of the products, we could start allowing for early working and early generic entry so that there can be competition. And those provisions are there. It will not be in contravention of those agreements, but it can actually help us facilitate access. But secondly, in facilitation of that access, it can be done within the context of tech transfer. And I think from that perspective, we can explore that. And I think the foundation can look at how best IP management can be supported in a manner that can advance access. Secondly, the regulatory barriers. I mean, we've looked at some of the, you know, early use provisions and look at how we can facilitate regulatory approval. And I think there are certain approaches that you can consider. You can look at how clinical trials are conducted in such a way that when you conduct phase 3 trials, you can set up mechanisms where you facilitate therapeutic access and do what you call implementation research in line with your plan for rolling out your program, and that you sort of support with pharmacovigilance to ensure that there's safety for some of the products before you expand. But of course, you probably know better that there are problems with licensing arrangements, and I'm happy that we've got medicines patent pool colleagues, but you know, it also takes capacity, and to invest in capacity of local companies to understand what licensing arrangements should be considered, how they can apply, how they can take advantage of tech transfer. These are some of the things that I think this foundation can consider, including investment in regulatory science, because regulators have to understand technologies so that they can regulate better. I always say, you know, if you over-regulate, it kills innovation. If you under-regulate, it exposes people to harm. So it is in that respect that you have to look at effective regulation and essential regulation. I thank you.
Thank you for that, Precious. Very, very helpful response. And absolutely, all of those areas that you mentioned are definitely focal points of the foundation. Our next speaker joins us online, Dr. Richard Hatchett. He's the CEO of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Initiative, a very important global agency that has been part of the WHO's ACT Accelerator initiative, which works very closely with Gavi and is pioneering research and development of new vaccines for future pandemic preparedness. Richard, I'm very pleased you're joining us today. And my question for you is that your organization has been an important funder for 2 of the 3 front-runner COVID-19 vaccines, both Moderna and AstraZeneca. In this regard, can you reflect on how publicly funded R&D can promote better distributed regional manufacturing, particularly in Africa, whether we can actually think about CEPI's past experience and include provisions for tech transfer and tacit know-how sharing for the future to build capacity for African firms? Relatedly, how can we better link R&D funding to global equitable access in terms of immediate supplies to African countries?
Great. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you very well.
Great. No, thank you for the question. Let me first greet the Honorable Minister of State, Dr. Batera, Dr. Adesina, and my distinguished fellow panelists and ladies and gentlemen. Professor Sampath, it's really a pleasure to join you today. I am sorry that I can't be there in person, but I'm deeply honored to be included in this distinguished panel. And before anything else, I'd like to commend the African Development Bank for establishing such an important initiative for enabling equitable access of medical countermeasures, and just say that we at CEPI very much look forward to working with the APTF going forward. To answer your question, clearly we must prioritize addressing and improving upon the inequities that we've seen in the pandemic, which have disproportionately impacted the people of Africa more than any other region. But before we can address those problems, we actually need to learn the lessons that the pandemic can teach us. First, I would say in a pandemic, perhaps in public health emergencies more generally, the causes of inequity are not necessarily those that give rise to healthcare inequity in other circumstances. They overlap, of course, but they're not identical. And second, in a pandemic, the root cause of inequity is scarcity. And in this world, inequity cannot practically be reduced without easing scarcity. Although achieving equity also requires more, actually much more than merely the elimination of scarcity, as we saw during the pandemic. Even when scarcity was addressed, there were still problems of financing, problems of delivery at a minimum that need to be overcome. So I think the big lesson that CEPI has learned, and as we think about how we use our R&D investments, the big lesson that we've learned is that the pandemic preparedness and response system as it existed in 2020 was not configured to produce equity as a natural outcome. And so at CEPI, we are now adopting what we're describing as a systems perspective on equity. As an organization, we know there are some things we can control, some things we can influence, and some things we can only advocate for, but we have to bring a systemic approach and understanding to everything we do, how we deploy our resources if we are to advance the cause of equity. You mentioned COVAX. Well, COVAX, which CEPI co-founded, and other global efforts, have made significant progress. There is much more we can and must do, obviously, and access is at the heart of everything that CEPI does. Our mission is through supporting R&D to accelerate the development of vaccines and other biologic countermeasures against epidemic and pandemic threats so they can be accessible to all people who need them. And we want to do that by giving the world a fighting chance of tackling and containing outbreaks before they spread and become pandemics by accelerating the development of countermeasures. Speed is actually really, really important. So we have to support innovation, the development of new technologies that can deliver countermeasures, specifically vaccines, much more rapidly. But that only works, actually, if vaccines are deployed in a country or region affected by an outbreak, regardless of wherever that is. We mentioned the TRIPS flexibilities. We think those are important. CEPI, frankly, is agnostic, which is not to say skeptical, about the TRIPS waiver that was proposed in 2021 as a remedy for the problems that we faced in 2021. But we are in deep agreement with those who advocated for it about the underlying diagnosis, that it was the concentration of vaccine manufacturing in a few regions, coupled with the initial scarcity, that caused the terrible inequity that we observed. I would say that a crucial learning from the COVID-19 pandemic is therefore that we urgently need to diversify vaccine manufacturing so every region can take responsibility for its own health security, and strengthening the infrastructure for local vaccine production across Africa will be paramount if we are to address the challenges and inequities we've seen. CEPI has very recently taken a step. On Monday, we announced with the Gates Foundation collectively providing $30 million to support South-South tech transfer from Serum Institute to Aspen. These are from routine immunizations for pneumococcal rotavirus, polyvalent meninge, and the hexavalent vaccines that will be transferred. CEPI doesn't normally get involved in routine immunization, but the reason we're supporting this technology transfer is that it will actually help sustain regional vaccine manufacturing capacity at Aspen for potential future outbreak responses, and thus create capacity on the African continent for the emergency production of vaccines in the event of future pandemics or epidemics. We think this kind of engagement and partnership, is absolutely critical. We need to do more of it. It will be critical for achieving our 100 days mission, the goal of delivering vaccines for use in 100 days. And I would just mention to the folks attending that we've recently released a report delivering pandemic vaccines in 100 days. What will it take is the title. It's on the CEPI.net website. Certainly encourage you to look at it. But a focus on speed should not distract from the importance of ensuring, and it of course will not by itself deliver equitable access. And we also need innovations in research, development, and manufacturing that go along with just the acceleration of speed. And you asked about how we can deploy our R&D investments. Our R&D investments can and must be a critical enabler of equitable access. As far as I know, no one has ever contradicted me. CEPI was the only major global funder that included equitable access requirements in its funding contracts for COVID-19 vaccines. And those access provisions secured many hundreds of millions of doses of vaccine for COVAX. One of the things that we're advocating for the pandemic treaty is that other R&D funders should be encouraged, or even public sector funders should be encouraged, even required, to include global access provisions. Even when they are making investments for their own country, they should also include global access provisions. R&D can also support access by developing innovations and products which are suitable for use in low resource settings. For example, CEPI has emphasized improving thermostability is a priority area for our own investment in innovation. That's just one example of how R&D can facilitate greater flexibility of use and thus greater access to products. We also need innovations that lower the cost of goods and services. We need to develop novel formulations such as nasally administered vaccines that are easy or easier to distribute and administer. And finally, we need a continued strong focus on increasing capabilities to deliver vaccines to all segments of the population in low and middle income countries. And we really can't wait for the next global crisis to make these investments. I just want to thank you for the opportunity to offer some remarks and just say how much I look forward to working with the APTF.
Thank you very much, Richard. We also at the APTF look forward to working very closely with CEPI. Our next panelist is Professor Carlos Correa. Professor Carlos Correa.
Professor Sampat, unfortunately you're muted, so those of us online can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. We really look forward to working very closely with CEPI at the APTF. So thank you for those ideas and the offer for collaboration. Our next panelist is Professor Carlos Correa. Professor Correa needs no introduction. He's one of the leading experts internationally on IP and tech transfer issues. So, Carlos, welcome. I'm very pleased that you're able to join us remotely today. My question for you is very simple. There is, we see extensive discussions always internationally, regionally, on tech transfer that avoid the mention of intellectual property. There's also a general lack of understanding on the connection between intellectual property and tech transfer. Some people even say intellectual property doesn't matter. Africa can go on to build its capacity and produce vaccines and drugs. Can you elaborate the role that intellectual property plays in tech transfer, shedding some light on how, without licenses and other know-how sharing mechanisms, we have faced difficulties in the African continent in the manufacture of COVID-19 products?
Well, thank you very much, Padma Shri. Thank you for inviting the South Center to participate at this meeting. And really, I want to commend the bank for establishing the foundation. I really appreciate very much the rationale that was presented earlier for the work of the foundation and the very realistic programs that you have. So I think it's a fantastic initiative, and be sure that the South Center will support it in whatever manner we can. So coming to your question, Padma Shri, as we know, intellectual property does confer legal monopolies. And this is not a political statement. Even in the jurisprudence in the United States or in Europe, you will find the courts refer to patent, for instance, as the basis of legal monopolies. And then the legal monopolies give the power to the right owner to share or not the technology. In fact, when the TRIPS agreement, which was already mentioned, was negotiated, one of the promises by the proponents was that stronger rights in the area of intellectual property will ensure more transfer of technology to developing countries. But the evidence is that this has not happened. In fact, when stronger rights are conferred, they give a higher capacity to right owners to control the markets through importation. And very often, the company's choice is as to supply a market through importation and then to retain the value added in the exporting country rather than giving a license or producing in the importing country. So this is the reason why we have seen that maybe there hasn't been sufficient transfer of technology since the TRIPS agreement has been approved. And this is why it is important to actually use, it was already mentioned, the TRIPS flexibilities And one important flexibility with the South Center has worked a lot is the fact that when a patent is filed, patent application is filed, it's very important to make a very rigorous examination of the patents in order to prevent the grant of patents, which are generally called evergreen patents, that will just block generic competition, legitimate generic competition. This will be extremely important for development of the pharmaceutical industry in Africa, as well as the use of other flexibilities, such as compulsory license or the research exception. So on this matter, then intellectual property rights do matter. It's important for the region to have the appropriate framework that will allow the pharmaceutical industry to develop. And let me add here another comment, which relates also to access to technology. And this is the important role that South cooperation may play in facilitating access to technology to local firms in Africa. As you know, South cooperation has become a very important tool for development. And in this particular field, many companies in the South can actually be extremely helpful in transferring technology to companies and other institutions in Africa, and also to do more South-South cooperation in the area of research. So coming to the second part of the question, certainly the lack of access to technology was a key factor explaining the lack of equity in the supply of vaccines to the developing world. So this was key. It was not the lack of manufacturing capacity. As we know, it was possible to manufacture vaccines in many places around the world, including in many developing countries. Plants could be repurposed in order to produce vaccines, in particular biological plants. The problem was that there was a reluctance by the companies that held technology to share that technology. As you have mentioned, the experience of the messenger RNA hub in South Africa, there was a refusal to transfer technology in order to speed up the development of vaccines there. We know that the case of the CTAP was already mentioned, that there wasn't a real participation by pharmaceutical companies. The CTAP received some diagnostic kits technology from a Spanish institution, some upward technology from NIH, but they did not receive the technologies were necessary to speed up the protection of the production of vaccines. And this is the problem. So manufacturing capacity was there, and the access of technology was the key factor. This does not mean that it is not possible to develop the know-how in developing countries. It is possible. The problem is that it takes time. And then the request was for the companies and the governments to support timely transfer of technology. As we have seen, countries such as Cuba, China, India have been able to develop their own vaccines. And some have also entered into the domain of the more complex messenger RNA vaccines, such as the case of Thailand and also China. So it is possible. So the question was about timing, about the urgency. And therefore, creating the capacity in Africa to develop vaccines and to produce medicines is crucial. We as a South Center fully support this. A large number of African countries are members to the South Center. We're very happy to cooperate with the foundation, including, for instance, increasing the capacity of local companies to negotiate licensing agreements, which would be an essential tool in order to achieve the objectives that you are pursuing. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this opening session.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And I think timely transfer of technologies is a very important thing. It's a key word for the APTF. Our next speaker is Miss Birgit Pickel. She is the head of Africa for the BMZ, Germany, and she joins us online. Birgit, welcome. My question to you is very simple. Germany has a long-standing commitment towards promoting domestic manufacturing in Africa and has also been very active since the onset of COVID-19 in accelerating vaccine production. What can we do in this sense, your ministry, the BMZ, do to facilitate more partnerships between German companies and the German public sector institutes with their African counterparts in the pharmaceutical and biotechnology sectors in Africa? What additional kinds of technology alliances can we consider outside of the BioNTech collaboration that's currently going on in Rwanda and Ghana? And how can we work together to make it happen?
Thank you very much, Professor Padmasree. Very nice to see you again. And thanks to the AFDB for bringing all of us together here today. Thanks for the kind invitation to be part of this panel. Your Excellency, Minister of Rwanda, and other panelists, a warm welcome from Germany in this early morning hours to all of you. From the German side, from the beginning, when the pandemic started, we recognized the importance of developing local markets. I mean, the good thing about the pandemic is that this issue came to the fore, local production in Africa. Maybe it hasn't been at center stage, and the pandemic, COVID, helped us to put it in the right place and discuss really this issue, which is so important in the end for moving towards health sovereignty on the continent. From the German government side, we strongly support all the moves at the institutional level that have been made in the last years since the pandemic started, in terms of creating an architecture and institutions, like also while you're in Kigali, the upcoming African Medicines Agency, the strengthening of African CDC, etc., but also all the local efforts in various countries like Rwanda, like Senegal, like Ghana, like South Africa, to really address the issue of how local capacities for manufacturing of crucial health products, including vaccines, can be improved. So Germany fully supports this agenda, including the African Union's goal to reach 60% of local vaccine production by 2040. We really welcome in this broader context also the setting up of this new foundation, thanks to the AFDB. And as a board member, we were in fact early on part of the process of supporting the setting up of this foundation, which can play a crucial role now also in addressing the key bottlenecks on the technology side and on market development, not, as Professor Padmasree said in the beginning, a product-based approach, but really a market-based comprehensive approach that looks at R&D, at skills, at the needs of companies, technology transfers, licensing, voluntary licensing, and all the issues involved. Negotiation capacity, we think that is really crucial to take this comprehensive approach, and we stand ready from the German side to support this. Just one more mentioning on what we've been doing from the German side before I come to your question, Padmasree. As part of the Team Europe approach, but also in cooperation with other multilateral actors, African partners, we have really put together a quite comprehensive support package over the past 2 to 3 years, with commitments over more than 550 million euros for the development of these local vaccine and pharmaceutical production capacities and markets. We know that, and this includes country-based initiatives. It includes support to the African CDC, to the existing regulatory initiative on the African continent, and possibly also to the AMA. We think that with this external support, a lot of which addresses really the key issues like regulatory strengthening and harmonization, workforce training, R&D, promoting technology transfer, can kickstart and support this important discussion that is now going on the continent. And we as Germany stand ready to support. We think that also support at the company level, and this is also included in this 550 million package, which I mentioned, is important. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Aspen in South Africa was already mentioned as a company, as one of those companies that has capacity, that started producing on early vaccines during the COVID crisis. We think it's important to strengthen those companies that are already there, and it is in this spirit that we are supporting through our development bank, DEG, Aspen with a credit of 144 million euros, but also there are other companies involved to look at the digital part of things, the digitalization of production, which is so key in these times to really look at state-of-the-art capacities on the continent. Let me just also mention, because the issue of IP and technology transfer has been mentioned here, we are also supporting and have been from the beginning the mRNA technology transfer hub in South Africa with a contribution of 3 million euros. We think that also the hub in cooperation with the Medicines Patent Pool already plays a crucial role and should continue to do so. And we are very keen to learn more about how the existing structures like the hub and also the new foundation will actually work together to build on the capacities that are already there, use them and develop them further. And we stand ready to be part of that exercise. Let me just quickly move on to what is needed for to facilitate more partnerships. I already mentioned our support to the mRNA hub. I think that is important. We're happy to cooperate with the foundation. We think that actually the sharing knowledge about what is going on the continent at the moment, this conscious effort of developing the markets beyond products to a comprehensive market development is very important to also get the attention of companies to invest. We think a firm political commitment also by governments to actually invest themselves into these markets is important. We know it's a private sector driven exercise, but public sector needs to play a role. And historically, investment in many countries in the health sector and in pharmaceutical production just hasn't been strong enough. And we think that political commitment by governments is needed as well. We see a big potential in the recent decision by Gavi to actually start sourcing and procuring through local companies while they're being developed or while they're already there, can be a real game changer to actually develop these markets. And I'm sure companies in Germany and Europe stand ready to partner up with these emerging companies on the continent. And as part of the Gavi board, also the Global Fund, to mention it here, beyond Gavi, because it's not only vaccines, it's the whole pharmaceutical market we need to look at to strengthen health sovereignty on the continent, will have to play an important role. And we stand ready as the German government to play our part in the boards of these institutions so that local production does become a priority for these key procurers of medical products on the African continent. So in this overall sense, let me stop here. I get a signal that time has elapsed. We stand ready from the German side to support the foundation, also to support this important market development and market shaping exercise on the African continent, always with the overall view to improve health systems, basic health systems, and thereby to provide, in the end, a better life for the African people on the African continent. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Birgit. Thank you, Mrs. Picot. This was fantastic. We look forward to partnering with the German government and with German firms and with Team Europe. And as my colleague VP Quaynor mentioned, this is a Pan-African agency. It has an eminent advisory council, which comprises of the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, Dr. Ngozi, the Chairperson of the African Union, Ambassador Moussa Faki, the Head of Bharat Biotech, Dr. Krishna Ella, the President of the Freer-Croce Institute, Dr. Nisia Lima, and a couple of other global thought leaders. With that, I move to our last panelist, Professor Fred Abbott. He's a global expert on licensing, and we are very pleased that you're here with us today. Fred, you know that the APTF wants to do voluntary licensing, but also exclusive and non-exclusive licensing. We want to focus on the full spectrum within the APTF. That's the scope. Could you, from your experience, talk about how difficult it is to arrive at different kinds of licensing templates and how the APTF can do this kind of work to promote timely transfer of technologies, as Professor Correa has stressed, and equitable access, as Dr. Matsoso has talked about, in the African continent?
Well, thank you very much, Padmasree, and let me say what a pleasure it is to be here with so many friends and colleagues today who've been working in this field for quite a few years, including sitting next to me, Dr. Precious Matsoso, who really began a lot of these initiatives back already more than 20 years ago. We've had great introductions of the why, and I'm not going to go into that. Just one remark that without sustainable financing, nothing really works. And that's really critical with the establishment of the foundation and with technology transfer and science and technology. So just a few key points. Number one, no one developed a sophisticated vaccine or technology product on their own. If you look at the mapping of what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, there's a complex web of interrelationships that moved from basic science into the formulation of products, into the clinical testing of products, into the development of manufacturing processes, into the packaging and distribution networks and so forth. And each one of these relationships was based on a contractual relationship. And I would note that it's not just a matter of the contractual relationship involving technology licensing as such. And there I'd note that it should be clear by now that patents alone are not the answer to creating sophisticated products. Technological know-how, regulatory capacity, and all of these other elements have to be combined into these contractual relationships. But even beyond that, if you look, and we've had discussion already, of the relationship between Pfizer, which actually acquired its technology from BioNTech, and however these vaccines were created, that these were complex joint venture agreements which required not only an elaboration of the patents and the way the clinical trials would be conducted and the way products would be distributed, but also governance boards, expenses, audits, reporting, social requirements, indemnifications, liability, insurance, boards of directors, and so forth. So the net is that to truly develop a pharmaceutical sector, and Precious highlighted this, and it's very important, you have to talk about IP management in a broad sense. That is how you create the whole architecture to make this work. Now, as Padmasree mentioned, and I'll just spend another 2 minutes, I mean, we've had very extensive discussions and reviews of licenses throughout the course of this period, where you get into questions of exclusive licensing versus non-exclusive licensing, and can you negotiate for non-exclusive licenses? Can the CTAP program obtain technologies that can be widely distributed throughout the world? What are the limitations on the medicines patent pool? And should you employ geographic restrictions on the distribution of products? You have other important elements like step payments, right? When someone steps in and wants to take on a new technology, should they have to make lump sum payments at different stages of the development? How big will those lump sum payments be? What will the ongoing royalties be in the end? And it all gets down to, in some sense, economic modeling, right? It isn't necessarily always the best to have a non-exclusive license, because that doesn't necessarily give a particular company the ability to maximize the return on the investment it's making in developing the product. So there's a cost-benefit analysis. If you want companies to invest, you have to provide them an incentive. If you want investors to invest, they need an incentive. So you have to work out the balance of relationships and how that's going to happen. In terms of the foundation, which is really a great initiative, I think one of the key elements can be bringing together business, regulatory, science and technology people from throughout the continent to really understand how to build these relationships, how to draft the contracts, how to build into the financing, and which provisions work best in which environments. Because it's said so often, one size does not fit all. The different problems that you're trying to tackle require different relationships and different solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. That was most informative, and that was, I mean, it's exactly what one of the arms of the APTF intends to do, really help transact for technology. So with that, I think we have a little bit of time. We have time for just 2 questions. And so I would like to invite the audience to ask any questions that they may have from this panel. I already see 2 hands, so please. I actually see 3 hands. So could we, I think we'll take quickly the 3 questions and then have a very short round of answers and then move to closing by Professor Banji Oyenka.
Good morning. Michael Maynard from Avocare Health. Firstly, thank you very much to all the panelists for a really informative discussion. I have 2 questions. The first is, I may have missed the firms or organizations that have signed up to participate in the foundation. If you could maybe just give some clarity into who that may be and to what extent they've agreed from a vertical perspective to share their technology. The second question is with regards to how much focus there is on vertical integration. A lot of the investment, even recently into South Africa, seems to be limited to horizontal integration. And of course, that has some serious limitations when you're looking at the reliance and dependency that Africa still has on the rest of the world. Thank you.
So I think so Zen, and then I have the colleague from Vemos. Yeah, Zen. Yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Zen Rizvi. I'm from Public Citizen based in Washington, D.C. I wanted to pick up on something that Richard from CEPI said, which I think is really important, which is the idea of public funding coming with public conditions, right? Conditions for equitable access. And, you know, I think we've seen in the pandemic, frankly, one of the kind of elephants in the room is the fact that the companies don't want to do it, right? Like the companies don't want to do it. There's no reason why still at the end of 2022, mRNA drug substance is only being produced in Spain and Germany and in the US, right? Like that is a global failure of kind of catastrophic proportions. And so the question then becomes, how do we get the companies to do it, right? Or how can governments step up? How can funders step up and get the companies to think more expansively about equitable access? And so to the, you know, to this great initiative that was launched today, first, my congrats. And then second, my question would be, are you thinking about engaging with not just the companies, but with the funders themselves, right? Like, so we have, of course, you know, Richard from CEPI here, but also the German government, the US government. We know that there are literally billions of dollars of public funding that go many, 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 many years in advance of when the technology is actually developed. And so is there any interest in engaging on that? Because of course, you know, we sit in Washington, D.C., and we call for equitable sharing, we call for technology transfer, but it sometimes feels like a lonely fight. And so, you know, would encourage more on that perspective. Thank you.
Very quickly, the last question. Please.
Okay, thank you very much. Antonio Perrelli, Women's Foundation. I would like to address two questions, mostly to Honorable Minister of State Butera and Professor Sampat. The first one, I would like to know if the APTF is planning a tight collaboration on mRNA vaccines due to the complexity of the subject, as you highlighted during your first presentation, and which kind of collaboration is it in terms of which existing activities, initiatives such as Rwanda and South Africa and Ghana, BioNTech and the WHO mRNA hubs are involved and how? And the second question is mostly for Dr. Maxoso, and it's about the IMB zero draft, which was going pretty bold on technology transfer, and everybody welcomed this as a big success. And I was thinking, what is our expectation? Should we lower our expectation towards 2024, or is it feasible to keep this level towards the final draft and during the whole negotiation process, which is taking place during the next few years? So thank you very much. That was it.
Thank you for those questions. I'd like to invite our panelists just to have very brief 1-minute responses. So Richard, if I'd like to call on you to respond to the question by public citizen on CEPI.
Thank you, Professor Sampat. I think that the question of engaging the funders upstream of the development of finished products is something that has not been utilized by public sector funders globally to the full extent. I mean, it was actually utilized by public sector funders for national interest, most notably by the United States with Operation Warp Speed, which invested $18 billion approximately, but secured doses only for the US, and I think left a lot on the table in terms of leverage that they could have used to secure doses for global distribution. I would, certainly encourage Precious, Matsoso, in further negotiations to see to what extent, placing requirements on public sector R&D funders as a condition of the treaty might be possible. I think it's a very important opportunity to shape delivery and to shape partnerships with industry, and certainly partnerships with the other important factor to recognize in terms of the products that were delivered is that they were delivered by smaller innovators, often in partnership with larger innovators, Oxford AstraZeneca being an example, BioNTech, Pfizer being another major example, where the opportunity to secure those kinds of commitments is actually greater if public sector funding is deployed intelligently early in the process. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Richard. Precious, over to you for your response.
Yes, thank you very much. I must say that, the last 10 months were revealing in that it showed that countries, the 194 countries, can agree on certain principles. But of course, as you know, this is not written in legal text, and I'm cautiously optimistic that the zero draft that will emerge from this transitional phase that will serve as a basis of negotiations will capture most of the key issues that matter most. And I think particularly with regard to operationalization of these key elements that I think are important. And look, we need a lot of advocacy work. We need a lot of education, but we also need a lot of support. And I'm hoping that this institution, this foundation, is going to run those dialogues so that, countries can understand much better what those provisions that you're going to come up with in zero draft mean for them and how we can translate this into reality. So I'm quite, well, I still say cautiously optimistic. Thank you.
Thank you, Precious. Just one word from me for the two questions that came for the APTF. The APTF has received a lot of demand from different companies already, from different governments for different kinds of services. The Secretariat is a completely separate entity from the bank. The bank has launched the initiative and will support it, but the African Pharmaceutical Technology Foundation is a separate agency which is supposed to start its work very soon, and it will start working with all actors, global companies, southern companies, African companies, and governments in this mandate. Before I invite Professor Banjo Inka for closing remarks, I'd like to invite Your Excellency, Dr. Butera, for any comments and suggestions or remarks that you would like to make to the questions and the interventions.
So I think there was a question addressed to me. I think the APTF is leading edge institution that has potential to significantly enhance the technology that would permit production of vaccines, drugs, and other pharmaceutical products on the continent. And Rwanda has been selected to host APTF, and we have had good discussions with the delegation from AFDB. And so the success of the foundation, so we're going to offer a conducive environment for its HQ here. And the success of the foundation is a success for the continent. So any initiative, including the mRNA that you talked about, that will permit by manufacturing capacity on the continent is going to be supported extensively. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. I'd now like to invite our colleague, Professor Banjo Inka. He's the Senior Special Advisor to the President at the African Development Bank, to make the closing remarks.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I'd like to thank all our panel members, all our colleagues who made today a very successful event. I was quite worried about the time of day when this was going to take place, but I'm glad to see all of you here. And I'm told that there are like 8 other events going on simultaneously at 7 a.m. So it shows, you know, the interest that you have in this. Profound gratitude from the bank and the AU, which are the 2 leading African institutions that initiated this APTF. As Dr. Padmasha said, we are not, it's not a bank project, it is for the whole continent, and it's been politically supported by the AU. Secondly, we want to really thank and appreciate the outstanding support of the government of Rwanda, and particularly HE President Paul Kagame, who actually is going to be the chair of APTF. President Kagame is chairing this among all the other stellar individuals that have been mentioned as members of the Eminent Advisory Council. The foundation has been we've been in the making for a while. We have, you know, established this council. There's going to be a board, an executive board that's going to run it. And of course, there's also going to be the executive, you know, management structure, which will be based here in Kigali. They've already mentioned to you all the members here, including the WHO DG, WTO DG, and all our colleagues from the private sector who have generously are going to give their time to support the APTF. The foundation, as you have heard, is focusing on technology transfer to meet the needs of Africa. This should have been done 20 years ago. And I know there has been a lot of initiatives over time by many organizations to ensure that Africa has its own autonomous domestic manufacturing base. The COVID-19 pandemic woke everybody up. And I think now we need to move at a faster pace. We are also working closely with the government of Rwanda to ensure that the foundation starts its work early in 2023. We are going to have the first inaugural meeting of the members of the Eminent Advisory Council members, hopefully by the first quarter of 2023. We are going to be working with all the major institutions, the African Medicines Agency, the CDC, the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing, in helping the continent to achieve its goal of setting up a successful and competitive regional pharmaceutical sector. Internationally, we are going to be working with WHO, as you have heard from the WHO Deputy DG, and all the other international agencies across Africa to ensure that this becomes a leading institution across Africa. Now we've been talking about technology transfer. The notion of technology transfer recommends complementary action on our part, on the part of the recipient. We are very much aware that developing a sustainable autonomous industrial capacity demands also explicit technology investment to ensure that we have the right absorptive capacity across all the aspects that have been mentioned today: regulation, capacity, manufacturing at the local level, particularly for companies, for public research. And this is a major rationale for the APTF, for us to develop the capacity for domestic components for all the firms that will be involved. And for this reason, we are calling on all global companies, all southern companies, all African companies, as well as public research institutions, national governments, and international agencies to work with us to achieve the goals of the APTF. Our goal is for Africa to reduce its reliance on donations and to move into production. Our role is to ensure that we have an equitable, as members of the panel have said, timely and sustainable transfer of technology, with us also doing our part. Like I said, we need a complementary action to develop our own autonomous absorptive capacity in Africa. This is our call today to everyone here. And one more time, I would like to thank everyone. And as you support the APTF, you are not just supporting the setting up of the foundation. You know, we all know the faster the growth of manufacturing, the faster the growth of the economy. And the faster the growth of an economy, the faster you raise living standards of the people of Africa. So you are doing much more than just supporting the foundation. Thank you very much, all our colleagues today. And thank you for making time at this very unholy hour of the day. Thank you so much. Let's give ourselves